gospel lesson today is from John 18:33 through 37. We've been reading from Mark. Last week, Mark was where Jesus pointed out the temple is going to fall. And that kingdoms, basically, he was indicating, of this world are going to fall. Today is the dialogue between Pilate, the direct conversation between Pilate and Jesus. Hear now the word of the Lord. Then Pilate went back into the headquarters, summoned Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own? Or have others told you about me?" "I'm not a Jew, am I?" Pilate replied. "Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. But what have you done?" "My kingdom is not of this world," said Jesus. "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. As it is, my kingdom does not have its origin here." "So you are the king, then?" Pilate asked. "You say that I'm a king," Jesus replied. "I was born for this. I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Out of this world is today's title. We'll understand that in a moment. But Jesus Christ, our King, is the overall theme of this particular Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent. But we're looking at a conversation between Pilate and Jesus. Pilate's not the king. He's just a governor. He's just about, maintaining the law that was handed down to him. He's a feudal leader, we would say. Jesus is currently flogged and beaten, and standing in front of him doesn't look much like a king, does he? So Pilate questions Jesus. What questions does Pilate ask? And why? Jesus is a threat. Jesus is a threat. He's implied and almost directly told by the Sanhedrin, which is the leaders of the Jews, which incidentally, the phrase, "I'm not a Jew, am I?" is not something in this cultural context to be referring to all Jewish people. It is specifically referring to the Sanhedrin themselves, which is the Herodians, the aristocrats, the family of Herod, and plus the Sadducees and the Pharisees together. They form a group called the Sanhedrin, okay? So the Sanhedrin is what he's referring to. They're the ones that drug you in here. I'm not one of them. Tell me the truth, he wants to know. He goes on, actually, to ask the very next question, verse 38. What is the truth? And then we have the story of Barabbas. Isn't that interesting? We all know that Pilate eventually washes his hands, as the song goes, washed his hands and sealed his fate, if you're familiar with Mick Jagger's song. But that is because it wasn't Pilate that killed Jesus, and it wasn't the Sanhedrin that killed Jesus. It was our sin that put Jesus on the cross. And so a person had to be taken off of the blame for this. That's the symbolism of the hand washing. But certainly, Pilate suffered with this decision. The threat was to his power. His power was only possible to run Jerusalem and the Jewish people, the people of Israel. He was only able to stay in charge as long as they obeyed the laws of the Romans. He had a garrison. It says he went back into the headquarters. Do you know what that's referring to? That's a specific line that we need to understand. The Sanhedrin would not stand with him inside the headquarters. He brought Jesus in, just like what was it earlier this week? If you came to the Bible study, we talked about Paul being brought into the military quarters to prevent from being stoned to death. He brought Jesus in actually to spare him for a moment so that he could have due process before the people lynched him. So he's within a Roman place where unclean food is eaten and unclean acts are had. And therefore the Sanhedrin, worried that they'll become unclean, will not enter into the quarters. Even though they're invited, they're welcome. But they have refused Pilate's offer to come in during this legal proceedings because the Passover is coming. And they cannot be unclean for the Passover. Their own religious purity and self-righteousness prevented them from being present. And they're glad to be present. It's an excuse not be present because they don't want to be officially responsible for the death of this very popular man with the poor people. They need it to appear that Pilate is responsible. So Jesus is a threat. Not a physical threat to overthrow him, but a threat to his influence. And he must keep the Sanhedrin liking him. He's a politician. He is a great politician. And he knows that as a politician, he must weave this story. So Jesus speaks the truth to him. And he asks, what is the truth? Pilate must please the people. But for a moment, he sees the truth right in front of him. And he realizes he is about to send an innocent man to the cross. So we hear Daniel's vision. This is where the phrase Ancient of Days comes from. In Daniel's vision, we see God. God is the Ancient of Days in the beginning, referred to the Ancient One who sits on the throne. And then there are 4 earthly kingdoms brought about. Now, there is other places that break it out with detail, but I'll tell you what those 4 earthly kingdoms are. They're not like Mesopotamia and Rome. Those aren't the kingdoms he's referring to. They are the kingdoms of violence, destruction, exploitation, and oppression. These kingdoms, these are the way that kings wield power against the people and maintain that authority. They oppress the people. They exploit their belief systems, just as Pilate is actually exploiting Jewish belief systems in order to manipulate them, to remain them subservient. And they use destruction and violence if all else fails. Those kingdoms are kingdoms on earth, and we live among kingdoms on earth. Our kingdom is supposed to be led, the kingdom that we are all members of, led by a document called the U.S. Constitution. But it is a kingdom. It's a democratic kingdom, but it is a kingdom on earth that we live among. There are brothers and sisters who believe in Christ who don't obey the kingdom, and that's for them. That's religious freedom. Some that are not Trinitarians like us, not particularly Christian, and I'm referring to, and you probably have family members among this, the Jehovah's Witnesses do not acknowledge the existence of the United States of America. That's why we don't have Jehovah's Witnesses serving with us. Is it right or wrong? That's for them to say. It's their faith, and we respect their freedom. But it's an interesting thought, isn't it? Are we members of this kingdom or that kingdom? Can we be members of both? This is the debate we have to live and wrestle with our whole lives. But Daniel also says this magical person, the Son of Man, floats in on a cloud, a heavenly cloud, and he represents what? He represents truth and justice. Reminds me of truth, justice, and the American way, isn't it? But truth and justice, that is Jesus, right? Jesus declares that his kingdom is not of this world. It's out of this world. Is heaven like a place that we'll get to? Or is heaven a place on earth, to quote another song? Can heaven and this place, this kingdom, live inside our hearts? That is the question for us today to wrestle with. Can we be eternal members of this kingdom of heaven, citizens of God's kingdom, and citizens of our country and citizens of the world at the same time? Well, that's for us to struggle with. This out of this world place, have you ever felt like you are not of this world? You ever felt awkward and out of place with your social circles, with your friends? It happens. I feel like that often. I was raised basically as an only child, even though I have a much older brother, on a farm. And both my parents had careers, and they did their best. My mother particularly did her best. Mama, you did your best to make sure that I had social interactions. But ultimately, I really didn't. I always hit it off whenever we went to church functions or whatever with adults. As a kid, I talked like an adult. I stood like an adult. I wore my clothes like an adult. I was a little man. I like to say it still to this day, I was an old man when I was a kid. And so now I really am an old man, and I'm an older man. Like, I'm ready for just like, it's 8 o'clock, I'm going to bed. It's like last night, I'm coming back from dinner at 8:30 and people are going out. I'm like, are they crazy? I think to myself, I've got to sleep. Yeah. Am I right or wrong? Who's to say? Personal preference. You're okay if you go out at late at night. I'm not going to criticize you. But it makes me feel like I'm not of this community. And it's awkward. And I know, as I've spoken with at least 2 of you about this, sometimes you don't feel like you are members of this community because of your beliefs. You don't fit in. And that's okay. We are with Christ because we are citizens of Christ's kingdom. And we do fit in, and we do belong there. So what is Jesus teaching us? What is the moral of this lesson? We've already kind of touched on it. I've already kind of implied it, but we're going to just directly state it, name it, and claim it. We need to beware of the 4 kingdoms. We need to think of the kingdoms of violence, destruction, exploitation, and oppression. Why and how? We're not kings, so we're not doing that, right? But as we go through life, we may gain power over other people. Okay? I know at least 2 of us have kids, right? We have some influence over our children. Do we lord it like kings? Or are we leaders? There's a difference. Loving parents. So we have to be guarding ourselves against violence, destruction, exploitation, and oppression of others, but we also have to identify when those in leadership are doing it to us. In the Navy, we have multiple ways if we have unjust leaders to complain. We have a Simeo program. We can always make an IG. And if all else fails, we can do a congressional inquiry, right? Those are kind of like ambiguous. They don't really have detailed. The Simeo program is the best way to complain. But we have the ability to push back. If we think there's an unjust thing happening within our chain of command, we can call for captain's mast for ourselves and go directly to the CO and say, sir, my department head, my DIVO, my LPO is unjust. And here's why. We have a system to prevent being exploited and oppressed, and hopefully we never get to a point where there's violence and destruction, although I'm sure if we stay in the Navy long enough, we'll see some fist fights. Yeah, we're sailors anyway, right? It happens. So we are to guard against this, the four kingdoms. We're also to belong to the truth. Man, oh man, oh man. Pilate knew what the problem with truth was 2,000 years ago that we deal with today. Now we have it in a hyper speed using social media and technology. We don't know what true is anymore. I like to say there's the concept of ultimate truth, capital T, which includes spirituality, right? Then there is, we're coming down from that, there's a word coined by, I think, a modern day prophet myself. The word is truthiness. It's actually in the dictionary now. It means that there's one point of data that says what I'm about to say might be true, even though there's 15 points that say it's not true. There's one point that says it might be true. So I can make a statement, and we go with things we now call conspiracy theories. And we say, and we make these strange claims. And then there's this echo chamber that happens, a feedback loop that makes it louder and louder until so many people believe that that truthiness is ultimate truth. We use little points of data we call facts, one single fact, a mathematic thing, an observable thing. And then we move it up until it becomes truth or truthiness. And we live in a confusing time. But we have ultimate truth, and ultimate truth is within Jesus, who is a champion of truth, not a champion of this lunacy of truthiness. And so we should repeat truth. We should be those who seek out and ask questions when we see strange conspiracy theories and say, whoa, I'm going to have to check that first before I repost. Okay? So we need to belong to the truth and understand the difference between the kingdoms, the four kingdom methods, and God's kingdom. And finally, hope is in the heavenly kingdom. We will all succumb to the physical things in our lives and we will die. And our hope is that the truth will rise to the top, the kingdom of God. And so we put our hope in heaven. One little thing about Daniel's story you need to know that connects to that last statement is when he said that, the Jewish people were in the, I think it's diaspora, and the ones that he was speaking to were in bondage, oppressed by Nebuchadnezzar had just died, and the next king, I think of the Babylonians, I can't remember which one, if it's the right one, but the point is, non-Jews were in charge, and they were oppressing them, and they needed hope. And so his vision, his dream that he shared with them gave them hope. And for the next 200 to 300 to 400 years before Jesus came, they repeated that vision that Daniel had and said, there's a son of man who's going to float in on a cloud, and he's going to bring us hope. Many of them confused and thought that he would be a ruler who would bring an army and overthrow the Romans, when he's really trying to overthrow the four kingdoms inside our heart. So, our hope is in the heavenly kingdom, and our King is Jesus Christ. And that is our message.